after the COVID-19 crisis and how to repair the public finances. I'm Andy Silvester, I'm Deputy Editor at City AM, and I'm joined in turn by Steve Baker, Mark Littlewood, Matthew Lynn, and John O'Connell. And though they need no introductions, I will do when we go to them. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to the IEA and the TPA for putting on this extraordinary think tent this year, who have let no waves of misfortune of COVID-19 stop them from putting the think tent on. It's an annual highlight from many across the political spectrum, a place for original ideas that perhaps are sometimes lacking on the main conference stage, whether real or virtual. And indeed, we're here today to talk about some original ideas, such as the idea that perhaps it might be an idea to get sound money back in the game. There's no question that over the past year, many of the Conservative government's manifesto commitments around balancing the books and controversies around the fiscal rule, remember that in January and February, have gone by the wayside as we've attempted to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, and government has chosen the tactic of broadly locking down everything and spending all the money on everything else. We'll go in a minute to Steve Baker to discuss how he thinks the government will respond from inside Parliament. But here, as I sit in an empty city of London, it doesn't seem obvious that the economy is going to pull us out of this hole any time soon. So, Steve, over to you. What's your reaction to Rishi Sunak's speech? There wasn't a tremendous amount in it. And indeed, where do you see the state of the party right now as it looks towards restoring, perhaps, or indeed just changing the way it adopts balancing the books?
Andy, thanks very much indeed. I'm really delighted to be here. I want to make 3 points in response to your questions, but first to say something about the context. I think it's very important everyone watching this understands that the government has adopted a strategy now of suppressing the virus pending a vaccine. Suppressing the virus pending a vaccine. It's very clear that that's what they intend to do, that is policy, and that is what government is striving after. And Matt Hancock has said the alternative is to let the virus rip. I've said already, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think that there are other options, but we're not here today to discuss epidemiology, and certainly not my amateur take on it. But we have to understand as we go through the weeks and months ahead that that is the perspective the government has taken, to suppress it pending a vaccine. I hope and expect that means that they're expecting a vaccine soon, but that remains to be seen. So the first point I want to pick up on is Rishi Sunak saying he's committing himself to a single priority opportunity. Well, that's great. It was very interesting, though, to hear him say that he was going to be using the full might of the state to pursue individual liberty. Well, Rishi's no fool, of course, he's Chancellor of the Exchequer for a reason, but it is something of a contradiction that the Conservative Party is now pursuing the liberty of the individual using the full might of the state. And sometimes the full might of the state has been a frightening thing to behold. But we'll come back to it in a moment. I think right now we are living at or beyond the limits of taxation of the UK economy. And I refer to research by economist David B. Smith. He was good enough to provide a paper to the Treasury Select Committee, and you can find his work there. But he says that in 2019, we were at the historic limits of taxation of the UK economy. So if anyone thinks that the full might of the state is going to be used to any greater extent based on higher taxes, they're probably kidding themselves if David is right. The second point is about the public finances. So Rishi said that we always balance the books. I'm not sure we always do it immediately. And he also said that if we don't balance the books, what is the point of us? Well, that is a very bold way of making the point. But I think it's a very clear intention that Chancellor Sunak intends that we have balanced books and that we are headed towards a traditional Conservative economic policy. He talked about doing it in the medium term. So there's a very important debate ought to be had by this panel about when the medium term is. I think it needs to be around the time of the next election so that we can be seen to be credible in the pitch we make to the country for our next term. The third point I would make is we've just got to have a boom going for growth. This level of debt, I think we're going to have to tolerate. But what we can't do is allow anyone to tell us that whatever the troubles we have, we cannot allow people to tell us that it's because government's been too small, because we've run too many surpluses, because taxes have been too low, because we've borrowed too little, or because money has been sound. Because to make that case is, of course, to answer each point in turn. The government has been running deficits almost throughout our lifetimes, with a couple of exceptions. We're now in an extraordinary position where QE is running at a level beyond the enormous amount that government is borrowing. We're heading towards 745 billion of QE. It's the most extraordinary some. So we are in a real pickle. What are we going to do? Well, the Chancellor's clear we're going to balance the books. What I would say in finishing is that we need to be really careful, not only to deliver conservative economic policy, but to make it attractive to people. And that's, I think, where people like the IEA, like the Taxpayers Alliance, like journalists watching this and indeed participating in this come in. We've got to make it clear that actually, if we liberalise taxes, if we liberalise trade policy, if we liberalise regulations, then we can create prosperity through growth, and it can be inclusive and take everyone with us. If you look at the OBR's projections of debt, you know that we face some very important choices about who we are and who we're trying to become. I'm very clear we need to be a free market society, an entrepreneurial society, and I'm very pleased that that's the direction that Rishi Sunak indicated.
Thanks, Steve. And it's a good job I said you needed no introduction, because I forgot to give you one. Elected to represent Wycombe some 10 years ago now, Treasury Select Committee member.
Where has the time gone?
I'm sure you really do need no introduction. A reminder to all of those of you listening in and watching today that you can send questions in. We'll have a Q&A. It's a virtual rather than a stick your hands up and hope the chair calls you, but we'll do our best. Do put the comments in the YouTube comments box, or indeed just tweet at the Think Tent Twitter account. With no further ado, we're going to move on to Mark Littlewood. Now, Mark Littlewood is Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, the IEA's Ralph Harris Fellow, certainly a well-known advocate of free market economics and of sound money and of liberty across the airwaves and indeed in Westminster. Mark, you have watched the last 6 months. If you could sum it up in one word before we get to your comments, what would it be?
Horrific. I mean, it's absolutely grim. And we haven't seen the worst of it yet, certainly from an economic perspective. I don't mean from a health perspective, and I know we're not here to discuss those possible trade-offs or if there are trade-offs, but from an economic perspective, the pain has not bitten yet. It's just beginning to bite. I was doing a radio interview earlier today about cinema closures. This is just the start. State money has given the illusion of propping up the economy through the furlough scheme and emergency business loans and the rest of it. But the scale of the fiscal problem faced by Rishi Sunak is absolutely colossal. I mean, even a pretty hawkish free market libertarian like myself and many of my colleagues at the IEA might accept that in the times of a national crisis, and let's just say for the sake of argument, let's just assume that the government's response has been proportionate for the sake of argument. I think even free market classical liberal types would concede that, okay, in any given year, it doesn't matter if you run a budget deficit to deal with a national crisis. I mean, if the IEA had been around in the Second World War, I don't think we would have been saying we've got to balance the books rather than beat the Nazis. You know, I mean, if you really do have a national crisis, then even if you're somebody who believes there's a relatively small role for the state can step in. But here's the problem. We are doing so against a worsening backdrop. I'm very, very minded of that famous Warren Buffett quote that when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked. And that is basically the United Kingdom. We have got ourselves into the habit of running modest budget deficits during the relatively good times and running colossal budget deficits during the bad times. That is not a sustainable model by any manner or means. And worse than that, we have stacked up liabilities that we have no obvious way of funding. Steve correctly says that we're living at or beyond the maximum point of taxation. We're clearly spending well beyond the tax revenues, but it seems nearly impossible that the government can get in much more than about 38% of national income in tax, might make 39% this year. If you really want to squeeze the private sector until the pips squeak, that's about the most you can get in. This year, the OBR says we'll spend 54% of GDP in the public sector. Now, as a one-off occasion to deal with a national emergency, not of itself problematic. What is problematic is behind that, we're typically spending 43, 44% in a normal or a good year. So that is unsustainable over the long run. If you keep spending like there's no tomorrow, eventually there won't be. The always balance the books point, I mean, we can argue about what the medium term is. I think it's fantastically heroic to believe that this government will be running a budget surplus by the time of the next election. I'd put the chances of that very, very close to zero. When the Conservatives first came to power in 2010, they said they'd balance the books by 2015. Still hadn't managed that by the time this crisis hit in 2020. What to be done? Let me just finish with that. Well, actually, today, the IEA has put forward a fairly modest proposal, actually. You might expect to hear from the IEA that we sort of immediately need to halve the size of the state and have a flat rate of income tax and all of the rest. But in fact, today our chairman's put forward a new briefing paper that suggests if we look at the last 40 years or so, a golden era, which he defines as government revenues going up without sort of harming the rest of the economy, was about 1993 to 2003. If you wanted to pick an era in which productivity was going up, so household incomes were going up, but that there wasn't austerity at state level. Now, it might be that some of my persuasion would like to see more austerity at state level, but you might be able to have your cake and eat it if we were just to revert to the golden era of John Major and Tony Blair. I mean, hardly paragons of extreme free market economics, but nevertheless, over that period of time, we had considerably fewer regulations bearing down on business in general, particularly in the labour market. We had considerably fewer regulations and less burdensome regulations on our key productive sectors. The banking, finance sector and the IT sector contributed about 2/3 of productivity growth gains in that 1993 to 2003 period. They're now contributing virtually nothing to productivity growth, but they're under a colossal regulatory burden. The top marginal rate of income tax is now 62%. It was 40% under Major and Blair. Corporation tax started high, 33%, but was falling consistently throughout the period. The overall tax burden was stable, if anything, fell modestly over that period. I think that Rishi, who I know today, I've read his speech, I haven't listened to it. I understand it was quite difficult to listen to because there was a technical glitch. Paid tribute to sort of his predecessors, including Gordon Brown. I'm just saying, as a first step, you don't yet need to find the revolutionary zeal of a Margaret Thatcher, a Ronald Reagan, or a Steve Baker, although I would welcome that revolutionary zeal enormously. You just need to get the economy back to the slightly more free market position that it had under Blair and Major, hardly returned to the Dickensian workhouse, in order to start to see the economy move forward. It will not solve all of our problems at once, but a commitment to a lower tax burden, balancing the budget or running a modest surplus being the norm, not a once-in-a-generation event, which it presently is and could be a never event if we're not extremely careful. And be conscious that the more regulations that you impose on business, the less productivity growth you can expect. I'd even like post-Brexit us just to go back to whatever the prevailing regulations were in 1993 as our default position. So a modest proposal, but one that I think could get us out of the woods, and I hope that Rishi warmly adopts it.
Winding back the clock to 1993. That's something for us to think about. Wimbledon were in the Premier League at that point, so I'd be quite welcome with that idea. But thanks, Mark. We'll come back to you with questions later, and again, do get them in on YouTube and Twitter, and via carrier pigeon to the TPA offices if you're so inclined. We'll move now to Matthew Lynn, who's a financial columnist at the Daily Telegraph, is writing for Wall Street Journal's Market Watch, The Spectator, and Money Week, and he's also the founder of Endeavour Press, the UK's leading ebook publisher. Matthew, you write a lot about the state of the economy. I'll ask you the same question I asked Mark. If you were to sum it up right now in sort of 1 to 3 words, where would you be?
Well, yeah, yikes, yikes, terrible, and yikes again. I mean, obviously, as Mark and Steve said, it's a very, very bad economic situation. 20% contraction of GDP. We'll see, in the second quarter, we'll see what the final figure for the year is. But it's definitely not going to be. But we could argue in a different time and place whether the government's had the right response to the virus, whether it's been too draconian. We could leave that for another day. But obviously, the economy for what for all the reasons we know is going to be an extremely difficult place. And I think just getting on, following on from what the previous two people said, and on the main theme today. I'll just kick off with a few points, and then we'll open it up for discussion after the other speakers have chipped in. I mean, I think one thing I would say initially, we are obviously going to see a huge rise in the budget deficit. We're already seeing a huge rise in the debt to GDP ratio, over 100%, probably go significantly over that before we get back to balancing the books, which is going to be a way off, as Mark and Steve already said. The first thing I say is I don't think we want to, I think we should relax a little bit about that. In a world of zero interest rates, which are going to be around for a long, long time, I think, you don't have to be too worried about 100% of GDP. 10 years ago, we thought that was somehow terrible, that we had to fix that, we had to get back to 80%. I don't think we should be in a huge rush to do that. I think we can carry on 100, 110%, 120% of GDP without any particularly adverse effects on the economy. So we don't have to be in a massive rush to push through tax rises to try and get back to balancing the books, or to try and get that debt to GDP ratio under control. The second thing I'd say, which I think is important, is we don't want to bail out too many zombies. We don't spend too much. We have to spend a lot of money in this crisis, obviously, with the damage that lockdown and the virus has done. We have to spend a lot of money, but let's not go crazy. Let's not try to spend too much. And I think one thing we shouldn't do is prop up too many zombies. Like we see it today, Cineworld, the cinema chain, closing for a while. There'll be lots of course, very easy to say, you've got to bail out the cinema chains, you've got to give them some money. The truth is, maybe you don't. The cinemas are still going to be there. If the bondholders and the shareholders in that company lose the money, that's the free market. That's how it works. In a year's time, when it's safe to go to the cinema and they finally release a new James Bond movie and people want to go back, then someone else can purchase those assets at probably some kind of knockdown price, and get them back up and running again. So we want to be careful about the government not bailing out too many companies, when actually, there aren't, when you stop and think about it, there aren't too many adverse effects. There's bad effects for the individuals, the shareholders, the people who've got capital at risk, but that's tough, that's their job. But there aren't too many adverse effects for the economy. So you don't want to take on too much debt, because we've got to repay it one day, or even if we can push that a little further out than people think at the moment. And the third point I'd make, which I suppose is really the big one, Rishi Sunak's done a pretty good job, and he's very popular, which is good, and he's been innovative, and he's responded to events, very, very quickly. And I don't, it'd be hard for us to say, any of us to say we'd do a better job. An epidemic like this is an extraordinary situation. So I don't think we should be too critical of him. But the one point I would make is, particularly when he's talking about tax changes to get us out of this mess. Already starting to see leaks from the Treasury. Let's do a little bit on capital gains tax to try and claw back a bit more money. Let's take a little bit off entrepreneurs' relief. Let's do a little bit of VAT, get back $1 billion here, $1 billion there. I think actually, it should go back to the old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And actually, you could use the crisis of fiscal policy, the extraordinary amount of money we've spent having to deal with this crisis, and also probably the popularity of the Chancellor to actually see that this is a moment for genuine tax reform. Rather than saying, okay, we've got to claw back a few billion, let's do $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Just go with black. We have a tax system which I think we all know, and Mark would be the great expert on this, which is just a mess. It's tripled in size. It's incredibly complex. It's not fit for purpose. Rather than just trying to tinker around the edges to get a bit more money, I think this would be a really good moment to stand back and say, let's go with a clean sheet of paper. Let's say we need to raise 38% of GDP for the permanent future in taxes to pay for all the things that the state sector does. Let's look at how we do that completely afresh, and let's make it, most importantly of all, much simpler, much easier to understand, and just much more enterprise friendly. Make it much more entrepreneur friendly, much more business friendly, and much more growth friendly. Because the final point is that rather than tax rises or anything else, the way we're going to get out of this mess is to get the economy growing again. It's going to have to be very, very pro-growth, because we're going to need a lot of new companies, and most of all, we're going to need a lot of new jobs. We're going to lose a lot of jobs before this crisis is over. So, the only way we're going to restore them is to have pro-growth, pro-enterprise policies that create new jobs.
Thanks, Matthew. Never let a good crisis go to waste, as you say. We'll move on to John. I've got questions coming in, so we will open it up to the floor soon. But our last speaker is John O'Connell, Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, been at the CPA for 11 years now, making the case for balancing the books throughout that, written many a research paper on everything from Quango overspending to town hall chief salaries. John, you have been campaigning for balancing the books for, as I say, 10 to 11 years. Have you ever seen a stupid question, but you ever seen a situation like this? Do you ever envisage a situation where you were looking at the numbers you were looking at?
No, and as Mark hinted at, and Steve as well, that's part of the reason why one would hope that a government would run sensible public finances in good times, so that you are prepared for situations like this. I think also, it's been alluded to already, but the tax burden at the minute is the highest it's been. Well, at the time of the election, it's the highest it's been for 50 years, higher than any prime minister since Clement Attlee. And so we're, as David B. Smith said in his Treasury paper, we're at the taxable capacity in the UK economy as it is. And I also think beyond the numbers, which are obviously crucial, there's a very, very strong moral argument to not be increasing taxes at this time. But especially at this time, there's always a strong moral argument for low taxation, but one particularly now, given that the private sector has taken all of the hit, will be asked to pay the bills into the future. And when they've been told to shut their doors and close their businesses down, and then to hit them with tax increases, I think would be fundamentally immoral. So there's a very, very strong moral imperative to let the private sector get back on its feet and grow the economy. I think there's two quick points to make on tax. Matthew's already alluded to it. It's starting with a blank sheet of paper. I think the tax system is wildly outdated. And if we're going to embrace all the opportunities of Brexit, beyond responding to COVID, I think we need to be talking about pretty large-scale tax reform, eliminating loopholes, going for broad base and low rates, keeping some very simple principles, and making tax fit for the modern economy. What we can't keep having are these, shrieking headlines about corporation tax, which is a tax that's wildly outdated anyway. And doesn't do a decent job of operating in the 21st century. So I think we should be talking about a blank sheet of paper. We should also be looking at dynamic modelling of tax changes. I think the Treasury models can be too static, and for all the good work that the Institute for Fiscal Studies do, I think quite often their work can be a little too static, and I think we should be looking much more at dynamic changes to tax. The Treasury have trialled this a couple of times, most notably in recent years on corporation tax and fuel duty. So, the will is there in the Treasury to try some of this stuff out, and the TPA is going to be doing more work on this in upcoming months. But I think it's something we should definitely be looking at, because if we look at, say, something like stamp duty, when you cut stamp duty, of course, you make that purchase more affordable. But what you also do is free up more money for home improvements, and you get knock-on effects in the economy with people hiring workmen to come around and do the house up, and the money then flows through the economy. So you get those much more positive changes. So looking at that would be important also. And then, of course, there's spending. I think that the narrative about austerity really got out of control. I mean, there were areas of the public sector that did see significant reductions to their budgets, most notably local government, but there were many that didn't, and quite often projected spending increases when the actual increase in spending wasn't as high as the forecast. They were called cuts. And that narrative really got out of control. But I think the watchword of responsibility is going to be very important. And I don't think it's an unpopular message at all. If we remember back to 2015, Cameron and Osborne talked about spending restraint in that campaign, and unexpectedly to many in Westminster won that election. So there's still definitely space to talk about responsibility and living within your means. And of course, on spending itself, wasteful spending, and I think it's really important, particularly for the TPA, I guess, in a sort of selfish way, thinking about us, is to really start to put meat on the bones of what wasteful spending is happening, what's actually occurring across the public sector, rather than talking about it as an abstract concept. And that's going to be some work that we're going to be doing in the coming months. And I'd also say that the House of Commons Procedure Committee, when they recommended to implement a budget committee, which looked at spending before it happens, is a very good idea, I think. We've got the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee, which do fantastic jobs of doing audits after the fact, but it'd be good to have some analysis before the fact as well. And very last point, Andy, is just to say that if the government did get elected on a message of levelling up, and within that, of course, were some spending promises, particularly in areas outside of London, and if there are going to be some sort of unsexy, unglamorous, but very important infrastructure projects outside of London that need funding, then all's well and good. But I think that the government should be looking to save to spend. If they're going to spend money on that, fine, but save money elsewhere first. So let's look at some quangos that have, veered off course or have actually done the job that they were set out to do in the first place, and look at closing them down. Not simply, shifting the function around to a different area of government, but genuinely closing it down. So there are areas where the government could save to spend as well. And again, very final point, I know I said that already, but on the spending side, there is a moral argument too. There's a moral argument to keep spending reasonable. So I twin that with the tax argument, that it's not just about the numbers, that there is a very strong moral imperative to make sure that we run sound public finances on both sides of the ledger.
Thanks, John. Fascinating stuff from all our panelists. I think you'll agree. I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask the first question to Steve, but I'm interested to know what Matthew thinks about it as well, with what they've said. We talked about the need for going for growth. It's a kind of a focus across everybody's comments, that it's vital that the economy kicks back into gear. Steve, when you look at your party and you look at the manifesto and the promises that were made and some of the language around using the power of the state and unleashing the power of the state to help people and level up and all that jazz, do you, as a free marketeer, do you sense that there's an appetite now, maybe that there wasn't before the COVID-19 crisis, for sort of radical free market ideas to allow going for growth, where you basically say this might not be popular on the front page of the Mail tomorrow, but it will pay off in 4 years' time? Or do you think that the party at the moment is in a place where it needs to be, it's a bit more focused on how they can use the levers of government?
Well, I'm afraid it's both and. So, but I don't think that Chancellor would mind me saying that when he came to the 1922 some time ago, I said you need to do three things: liberalise, liberalise, liberalise. And it was the point I made in my remarks. Liberalise taxation, by which I mean lower and simplify, all that good stuff that Mark and John in particular would appreciate, the 2020 tax report that they did. Liberalise regulations, and I don't mean turn the UK into the Wild West. I mean, Mark's made a very good point. Let's have a look at what regulated 1993 looked like. It's a very, very interesting proposition, but we should be seeking to liberalise regulations, and we should be seeking to liberalise trade policy. And on that point, actually, we're doing a good job. We've rolled over and improved upon the Japan FTA. I'm expecting the Canada FTA to be rolled over and improved upon. The American one, I think we are making great strides on. We'll accede to TPP. If we came up with a new platform free trade agreement for financial services with the USA, with Switzerland, say, that would create a new standard for the world in our key area of comparative advantage. I'd like to see us do that. So liberalise, liberalise, liberalise. When I put those points to the Chancellor in front of the party cheered. So you tell me. I mean, I look at what we're doing with the Chancellor saying we use the full might of the state. I think sometimes we're afraid of being seen as a libertarian government. I am not afraid to be seen as a classical liberal or even libertarian, because I know that classical liberal free market ideas are the best set of ideas for politicians to make the people prosperous and happy and free. And that is why I adopt them, because I want the public to be prosperous and happy. So I'm not ashamed to say that I'm pro-market. Very interesting to hear John talk about morality. It's very difficult for politicians to talk about morality. I think if we do, people immediately find ways to show that we are immoral. But as he was talking, I found myself thinking, much as I do not like Ayn Rand's selfish philosophy, nevertheless, we're on the cusp of Atlas shrugging. So maybe we need John and the TPA to start making the moral case.
And Matthew, you talked about using this as an opportunity to actually go down some paths that maybe previously were thought to be a little too, putting words in your mouth, but a little too radical, a little too extreme. Is now the case for radicalism?
Yeah, I think there is a space for that. I mean, we just know that from political history, don't we? That I think I looked it up for something I was writing a little while ago. That the phrase "don't let a good crisis go to waste." It originated with Machiavelli. Somehow, not very surprising. It's the kind of thing Machiavelli would have liked, but it's been around for a long time, and it's just true that when you have extraordinary events, that you just create space which isn't there. And I think I think Steve is absolutely right what he just said. Some people within the Conservative Party and some of the think tanks are talking about it. I think generally, unfortunately, for people who believe in a slightly smaller state and a slightly freer, more liberal economy, it hasn't been good so far. I don't think so. I think actually, the people on the other side of the debate who believe in a bigger state and more regulation and more government involvement in the economy are probably having a better crisis than people on this side of the fence, and that's unfortunate. And I think we need to push back against that. But I do think, I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and perhaps the Chancellor in particular, do have the opportunity to do more on that. I think particularly Rishi Sunak, because in lots of ways he's really good and he's very popular, and we haven't really had a popular Chancellor for quite a while. Probably Gordon Brown, in his pomp, was the last one who was, a genuinely popular figure. Wasn't popular with me, but I think some people liked him. And it would be good to see him just pushing more to go for that kind of blank slate that we were talking about earlier. I mean, we talked about tax. I think it'd be great, rather than just letting the Treasury talk about individual tax rises here or there, to say actually we're in a fiscal mess. That's no one's fault. We all understand why that is. But let's actually maybe have a commission for a year to actually say, let's rebuild, let's just scrap our tax system, let's throw it out, or imagine at least that we just throw it out and come up with a completely new one. And some of the issues the Taxpayers Alliance in particular be talking about border-based taxes, lower taxes, maybe completely reforming corporation tax, lots of reforms you could do there, and in other areas as well, like employment law. I've been thinking about this a bit recently. We have a lot of people working from home. And that's probably going to be permanent. I mean, there was kind of trends, it was there, but obviously the crisis has accelerated it. But now we're seeing a kind of push to, have the same employment laws, the same employment rights that you had as somebody sitting at a desk in an office 40 hours a week, when you only come in, say, twice a week and you work from home other times. Maybe that's a slightly different type of worker. And actually we have employment laws which are kind of designed 100 years ago, from when the labor force was mostly men who worked in factories, and actually we're going to have a very different kind of labor force. We've already seen the rise of the gig economy, self-employment's been rising. Maybe we need new types of employment. Maybe we need new categories of employment, such as home worker or gig worker, where you have some protections, but you have more flexibility, and employers have slightly lower levels of regulation, slightly lower levels of obligation. And of course, as we know, that will actually create more jobs. If you regulate people and tax people a bit less for employment, then they're a little bit keener to go out and create new jobs. That's the way entrepreneurs work. So again, that would be somewhere where you could use the crisis to say, actually, our employment laws are 100 years out of date. Let's create ones that are right for the 2030s and the 2040s kind of economy that we're moving into. And it would be great to see the government using a bit more, kind of seizing the moment to create the space for genuine radical reforms, and also just to shift the terms of the debate.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, Mark, I'm just going to ask you a question that's been sent in, and kind of ask you a supplementary question. It's about, should the experience of bailing in companies from Andy Meyer, who then fail to deliver technology at vast costs, make the government more cautious about the latest wave of enthusiasm for tech state corporatism? And I guess this sort of the question I will ask you about that is, do you think the government, do you think it needs to make the case again for the free market in the aftermath of this crisis, when they've spent 6 months saying, we'll solve it, I promise?
Yeah, I think it is important. And what, you always look at speeches and you read through the runes. I mean, I can remember in the previous Conservative administration, the thing that irked me the most was both then Prime Minister Theresa May and then Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Hammond would often begin their speeches with saying, and it's therefore vital again that everybody makes the case for free market capitalism. They then signally failed to make that case themselves and segued smoothly into the next paragraph of their speech, which was how the state was going to intrude even more into private enterprise and spend even more of taxpayers' money. So to take Andy's question on the sort of bailing in and everything, what the government's got to distinguish between enterprise and markets on the one hand, and its involvement in business in the other. And I think the Conservatives have been very close to getting into a sort of corporatist approach with industrial strategies and pretending that they, the government, know which the emerging technologies and businesses and regions of the future are going to be, and to plan all this from Whitehall. What I'd like to hear from the Chancellor is some very specific ways in which he and the government are going to get out of my and other people's ways in order that we can run our businesses more efficiently and more effectively. And that's been almost radio silence, really. I mean, there's all, I'll help you with this. You can have an interest-free loan. You can put your staff on furlough. We'll cut your business. You cut your business rates. It's all been about handouts or tax cuts, not about regulation at all. And I think that the government needs to articulate that and needs to come up with a whole string of proposals. I mean, I agree with Matthew a lot on employment law, but that's sort of treated as a third rail. You can't touch it. You can't liberalise employment law in virtually any way. Everybody will scream about it. And I think we need to see a bit more bravery there. I mean, at the moment, the great private sector recovery plan seems to be entirely based on this new James Bond movie coming out at some point. I mean, this is going to be what launches our V-shaped recovery, is Daniel Craig is going to ride in on a white horse. Everything I've heard about this new James Bond movie is it's a complete load of rubbish anyway, a whole woke load of trash. So I wouldn't pin any hopes on that even for the cinema industry. But I think if the government's serious about having a market-led agenda rather than a state interventionist one, then it needs to enunciate the regulations and the taxes that it is going to repeal. And it has shown precious little appetite for doing that.
Thanks, Mark. I didn't realise you were a film critic as well as your Liberal
multitasking
leader hat. Steve, I know you wanted to come back on Matthew's points and perhaps add to some Mark's as well, and then we'll come to John.
Yeah, just wanted to make the very, very simple point that for some businesses in my constituency right now and across the country, all the government needs to do is let them get on with their normal business. So take events firms, they want to put on rock concerts, whatever. All they need to do is be allowed to do it, but if they can't for social distancing reasons. If we could get to a point where people who were at a low risk from coronavirus were able to go to concerts and so on, events firms would bounce back. There's a huge pent-up demand, I'm told, and they'd be able to get on with it. So some of the solutions to this really do just hinge upon the strategy that the government takes for dealing with coronavirus. If it's suppress until a vaccine, and we're waiting for a vaccine long after Christmas, then a lot of good firms who could do great stuff will go to the wall for want of customers being able to take their services. And there's no escaping that. And if the government insists upon waiting for a vaccine, well, I do hope that we get a vaccine sooner rather than later.
So I'm going to press you on that. So do you think then, reading between the lines, there might be a case for, age-based sort of liberalisation in terms of what you're allowed to do and so on and so forth? Because that's obviously where, if you look at the numbers, that seems to be one of the areas where you would define low versus high risk, for instance.
So I am very much in spirit with Lord Sumption on all of this and on our risks as individuals. And I'd also point out that it does seem now to be the case that local lockdowns are being questioned as to whether they actually work to get R down. If you look at a paper from the Royal Society, it seems to suggest something which came forward from a Bristol University paper, that R went below 1 before the first national lockdown. So it doesn't look to me at the moment like these lockdowns are actually effective. Well, if that is the case, whatever are we doing, taking away people's freedom and crushing their businesses with all of the non-COVID health costs that go with it, all the social costs? We've got to the point now where we've got wives saying they can't see their husbands in the care home in the last months of their life. This is absolutely devastating for people. Well, I would like us to be moving to a risk-based system. I would like us to be shielding those who are vulnerable, and I would like us to be taking a risk-based approach to everybody else and letting people take a choice based on sound information. But I have to accept that the evidence that shielding can work is relatively limited. That is what I'm told by an epidemiologist of my acquaintance. But I think as we go on into the months ahead, if we haven't had a vaccine in weeks rather than months, we are going to have to look at the path which I've just indicated. And I think actually Matt Hancock has been wrong to give us a false dichotomy between either suppress awaiting a vaccine or let rip. That isn't the choice. Epidemiologists are setting out an approach of the kind which I've just put to you. And frankly, it's of a kind that the government started with at the beginning of this crisis. You might remember we were supposed to be flattening the curve, and now we're suppressing our society until we get a vaccine. I do not want to live like this one moment longer than we absolutely must. If I could stop it today, I'd stop it today, but I'm not able to.
Interesting stuff. And yeah, as you say, obviously we're talking about tax and spend and repairing the public finances. The sort of step one in that process is starting to think about repairing the public finances, and that means moving to a new strategy. I think you probably say, John, I've just got a question in from Michael Bracken to target a balanced budget as the norm, not a once-in-a-generation event. Is there a case for government to completely rethink and reset the level of spending in one or more area? And if so, which? And the second question, which is something I want to ask you about, read in the Sun this morning, it's been kicking around for a few months, that it looks like fuel duty may well be finally on the table again for government tax rises. John, thoughts on those? One area where you'd look at the entirety of spending, and then again, some thoughts on fuel duty.
Spending as a whole.
Area where you would like the government to, this is from Michael Bracken, one area where you'd like to completely rethink and reset the level. So if we go back to Matthew's blank slate, what's first on your blank sheet of paper?
For spending, right, that's a really interesting question. I just because we're doing lots of research at the moment, I'd say the Quango state, I think we really need to rethink the structure of government. And that involves thinking about what the state actually does and doesn't do, what it should and shouldn't do. So if there was a blank sheet of paper, it would be very much that. The problem with that, of course, it'd take a lot of work to actually work out just how far the tentacles of the state actually spread. So I think getting control of the Quango state and the client state, whatever you want to call it, would be the first area I'd look at. And then you mentioned fuel duty as well, Andy. This was also said back in February. Is fuel duty now becoming like pensions and like wealth taxes mentioned at every sort of fiscal event, and nothing ever happens? I'm not sure. When we've talked about fuel duty in the past in public debate, it's often said that the fuel duty being frozen for X number of years has cost the Treasury X, and that's a problem for me. That kind of language is always a problem for me. It can't cost the Treasury if it never had it in the first place. We need to stop assuming that all of the money belongs to the Treasury and they deign to give some of it back to us. So if we can change some of the language on taxation, that'd be really good. But fuel duty going up, maybe it's inevitable. It has been held frozen for quite a while. I'm not particularly sure it would be all that popular in their newly gained seats in the North and Midlands, but there we are.
Understatement of the year, I think. Mark, I know you wanted to come in on that question about what one area you would take the axe to, but let's say rethink it. And then Matthew, will come to you because I want to ask you about the Bank of England, because the questions come in there about what they should be doing. So Mark, one area.
Yeah, welfare spending. This has got ludicrously out of control. I know that the minute you say that, you sort of sound like somebody who revels in people's poverty. That's not the case at all. But we've allowed welfare spending, all transfer payments, including pensions, amounted pre-coronavirus to about £12,000 per household per year in Britain. If you can't wipe out poverty entirely in Britain with that kind of spending, the idea that moving it to £13,000 a year will suddenly get there. I mean, as Reagan would say, there must be some serious overhead in here somewhere, because that is a colossal sum of money. I want us to rediscover the principles of Beveridge, that welfare support is supposed to deal with impecuniosity for a short period of time, ideally. And the idea that you now have, it's almost impossible to work out who doesn't qualify for welfare in Britain. I think it's me. I haven't got any kids. I don't get a housing benefit, but very, very few people don't qualify. And I think we have got to retarget the welfare state on, I mean, pick a number, but say the bottom 5 or 10% of people. Now, you can't immediately change that overnight. You clearly can't suddenly tell Mrs. Miggins, age 87, that, a state pension is going to be lower next week and forevermore. There are expectations that need to be grandfathered out, and those should essentially be put on the debt balance sheet. But we have got to get back to a system where our transfer payments approach in this country is to provide support, hopefully bounce back support, somebody unemployed for a short period of time, for, 5 or 10% of the population for sake of argument, not to have a welfare system in which the overwhelming majority of people qualify for something at some point. That's the biggest single item of expenditure on the ledger. You can't take an axe to it overnight. You have to fulfill your promises and your expectations to people, certainly over the short term. But if savings can't be found there for such an enormous amount of government expenditure that seems not to have succeeded in eradicating poverty in the United Kingdom, then I don't know where they can be found.
Thanks, Mark. Interesting stuff. Matthew, I sort of indicated I wanted to come to you, and a question has indeed come in about, tax and spend is important, but so is the Bank of England and interest rates and so on and so forth. So where I sit on Fenchurch Street, about, quarter of a mile away, people are looking over spreadsheets and thinking about negative interest rates, or thinking about the best way they can encourage growth through those kind of macroeconomic levers. Where do you see that environment going over the next couple of years? And do you think that there is a case for negative inflation rates to go to get the country going again, so to speak? Or do you think the case needs to be to bring it back to a more rational level, a more historically normal level of interest rates?
Well, I think 2 points on that. I think actually overall the Bank of England's probably not actually particularly an actor at this stage, except insofar as it does QE, it prints money to fund the government deficit, which we're going to have for a little bit longer till it brings it under control. There are going to be question marks about how far you can do that, but it's probably a bigger subject for another day. I think the Bank of England could do two things that would help. I just don't think we're going back to, there was still a kind of idea of normal interest rates, somehow being around 5%. And I think actually that's not the normal interest rates. I think, it was probably true after the financial crash a decade ago. We went to just above zero. Japan was a long way ahead of us on this. Once you get to those kind of zero levels, for all sorts of reasons we could discuss, you're not going back to 5%. That's just not going to happen, probably in my lifetime, probably for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years or something. I'm going to give it my cat, which my cat's used to the side. We'll get more hits on YouTube now, because it was a funny cat video. Sorry about that. I'll get rid of that. What was I saying? I think the Bank of England should make it clear. I think it probably slightly overhangs the financial market. It slightly overhangs consumers. People are looking. The building societies, mortgage companies are looking at it. Borrowers are looking at it and thinking, "Oh, well, hang on a second. How much would this mortgage cost me if interest rates were 7% like they were in the 90s?" And actually, it's just unrealistic. That's almost certainly not going to happen. And I think actually they could make that clear to us. That would help the economy a little bit. I think the second thing they should do is rule out negative interest rates. Negative interest rates have been tried around the world. They're a weird idea. And they don't really work. They don't help. Actually, they're destructive, because they're destructive for two reasons. One, because they make the banking system virtually unworkable. They make it really, really hard to operate any kind of normal bank. A healthy banking system is just one of those fundamental things that you need for a healthy economy. Most of the time it's not very showy. It's kind of like having roads, but it's part of the infrastructure. And if you destroy your banking system, or if you cripple your banking system, which is what you often do with negative interest rates, then you hold the economy back, and you won't notice for a while, but you will notice eventually that the lending isn't flowing through, that it isn't going to companies. So I think what they should probably be doing is saying, we're not going to increase interest rates back to what used to be a normal. The sort of range between 0 and 1.5% is the range we're operating in for the foreseeable future, by which we mean possibly a decade or two. But B, we're not going to go negative. We think that would be destructive, and that doesn't leave very much for the Bank of England to do. They might do the odd quarter point here or there every 2 or 3 years, and so they're not going to be a huge actor. But I think actually just those two very simple things would be what they could do to help. And actually, we don't really want activist central banks. I think maybe in the last 20 years, we expected a bit too much of central banks. Central banks could somehow, sort out all the problems of the world, and that's not really true. What central banks can do is control inflation. Not much sign of that being a problem at the moment, and provide a sound banking system, a sound financial system, and sound money. And those, it's quite a small technical task, although it's actually really important, because as long as you get it right, the economy can function. As soon as you don't get that bit right, then you've got an economy in big trouble.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Oh, yeah, go for it.
Can I just pick up on something that Matthew said? I think he's absolutely right to say that they will try to keep interest rates at or near zero for as long as possible, because it's now existential for the state. If inflation picks up, the bank will act to meet its target, and that means it will end up pulling the plug on the state finances by ending QE. That is, they used their own language in order to make sure the horses were not scared, but that is what the bank told us. In different speeches, members of the MPC have been clear that just looking at the numbers, then it appears that the bank is funding the government. But the bank isn't funding the government, because the MPC is independent. And so you go back round to the circle that if inflation picks up, they'll pull the plug. Matthew, also, I hope you won't mind me taking issue with one point, Matthew. Yes, central banking ought to be a small technical function. But if, like me, you are cursed by having read deeply into the Austrian school, then at the moment you are racked with anxiety that these interest rates are sowing distortions in the economy which can only backfire. Now, I haven't got time to go into it, but I think this is the single biggest question in economics today. Are interest rates where they are because of the savings glut, which seems to be what the Bank of England believes, or are they here because it was a matter of policy and choice, which I did once get Mark Carney to admit on the record, and which you can see if you look back to the global financial crisis? Personally, I think we're headed into a monetary crisis unseen in our lifetimes, at least, as the post-Bretton Woods monetary system comes unwound. For 40 years, it's been paying for excess spending through increasing the money supply. I don't believe it can go on much longer. I think that is the biggest issue we face.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to ask one last question of the panel before we wrap up. So please do keep your answers brief, indeed almost as brief as Rishi's speech. It will simply be, what one thing would you like Boris to say when it's his turn to stand up in virtual Tory conference? And whether it is to be honest to the public and follow through with it, or whether it's a policy that they will actually go ahead and do rather than float. John, what's the one line you would want to? What's the one line you would be sneaking into Boris's speech for him to read out on the auto cue?
Whether it's the right forum for this or not, I'll put it in anyway. Mine would be to cut employers' national insurance. It's a personal, one of my most hated tax, and I think at a time when we need to protect jobs and have more created as the economy grows, mine would be to cut the jobs tax and cut it quite aggressively.
Mark?
I'm not really looking for a specific policy initiative. I'm looking for a coherent narrative. I'd like the Prime Minister to say that his plan is that in virtually every area of British life, the state will seek to do less over the course of this Parliament and allow free men and women to do more. That will start with what Steve alluded to, unwinding, not just unwinding, abolishing the coronavirus restrictions as soon as we can abolish them in full. No sort of overhang legacy of, keep face mask wearing in restaurants because it might prevent the spread of the common cold. No different excuses to keep regulations in place, which often happens after a time of heavy regulation. But that we want to fully abolish all of the regulations there as soon as this pandemic is at an end, either because we get herd immunity or we got a vaccine or whatever. And the plan of the government between now and the next election is to seek to spend less, balance the budgets more, and to give more room and oxygen to the free market side of the economy, which heroically and miraculously, whatever burdens you put on its back, somehow seems to come through. I know everybody has been, a good number of people have previously been standing on their doorsteps applauding the NHS workers at 8 o'clock on a Thursday. I think we need to reserve Fridays to applauding the supermarket workers. How on earth the for-profit free market sector has kept our food shelves stocked on very tight supply chains is a sign of how brilliantly entrepreneurial people can be if you let them get on with it. Boris Johnson said something like that. I wouldn't hold him to a specific policy pledge, but I want to know the direction of travel that his government wants to go in as soon as we get out of this hole.
Thanks, Mark. Matthew, one line, couple of lines.
Yeah, I mean, you'd like to see the kind of bouncy pro-business Boris, who hasn't been so much in evidence for the last 6 months. And I think, as I said a little bit earlier, mostly the people on our side of the fence, we might disagree a bit on some of the details, but people on the kind of pro-business, pro-enterprise, pro-free market side of the argument I don't think we haven't been having a good crisis, unfortunately, and it's been it's turning into an excuse for a big increase in the size of the state, more regulation. I'm worried, as some of the other speakers have said, that will stick around. And I think the one thing Boris could do is say that the thing that's going to get us out of this crisis, the thing that's going, if we lose 10% of GDP, if we lose 2 million jobs, the thing that's going to get us back that 10% and hopefully a bit more, the thing that's going to create those 2 million jobs we're going to need to replace the ones that are sadly going to be lost is entrepreneurs and business, and we've got to unleash that. We just got to be pro that. Just some of that enthusiasm and zest and vim to come through would be fantastic.
Brilliant. And Steve, last word to you.
I would ask the Prime Minister to echo what Rishi said by saying this: I am dedicating myself to a single priority, enlarging liberty under the rule of law.
And on that bombshell, we will bring this to a close. I dare say many of you will agree with all four of those those remarks. Whether we will see them in Boris's speech, we, of course, await with bated breath. Thanks so much to the panel. I would applaud you and ask the crowd to applaud, but I don't really know how you do that in digital sign. So congratulations. Thank you very much. We will allow this panel to move on and return to their normal lives. But in half an hour, the Think Tank will be back up in virtual form. It will be the next panel is the free speech crisis with renowned Shrinking Violets, Toby Young, Lawrence Fox and Inaya Follerin. That starts at 2:30, available via thinktank.co.uk as well as on the Think Tank YouTube channel. From me, Andy Silvester at City AM, all I have to say is thanks so much to the IA and TPA for organising, all the staff behind the scenes, from Harry to Annabelle to Sarah and everybody else. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.